this last few months has kind of been an emotional, spiritual roller coaster for me, and usually my spiritual, emotional state is connected to what I'm spending all my time focusing on during the week, which is typically what I end up teaching you on Sunday mornings. And if you recall, so long ago, we spent 8 weeks on impact and persecution. The reality that for the people of God from the beginning, especially for the followers of Jesus Christ living as aliens in a hostile world, we have this promise and anticipation of impact, changing lives, changing the world, and this parallel promise of persecution, that anybody that wants to live godly in Jesus Christ is going to be persecuted. And those two realities, and the truth that we're going to face both persecution, but we're going to have impact as long as we continue to stand strong for Christ and continue delivering his message. That part of the series on persecution kind of bummed me out for a few weeks, but we're rescued by Easter when we began a complementary series on the rewards that God promises his faithful servants as we stand for him, stand for truth, and experience persecution. He gives us these carrots so that we can endure, so we can move forward, so we have motivation to live for him. And the Bible is filled with these promises of rewards that serve as motivation for us for living the Christian life. Jesus wasn't afraid to entice us with these rewards. Actually said this is part of the blessing of being his follower. Although we will be despised like he was, abused like he was, he says we're blessed when we experience that type of persecution. And he says we should be glad, we should find joy even in the midst of our difficult walk with Christ, because we have great rewards coming. Last week we started looking into some of those multifaceted promises of rewards, and we stepped into the book of Revelation, because the book of Revelation it talks about the future. It talks about the judgment coming for those who have committed treason against King Jesus, but also talks about the rewards. The fulfillment of those rewards in the future. We kind of get a glimpse into what's coming for us after Christ comes back. So we've been looking at some of these rewards promised in the book of Revelation. And these rewards are promised to those who hold fast and those who conquer. And we noted last week that the conqueror isn't a super Christian. The conqueror is the one that, despite our weakness, we have kept his name, and we have kept his word and not denied his name. That's what Jesus presents in the book of Revelation as the definition of the one who has conquered. You've done your best to obey and conform your life to the standards of Christ, and you've been proud of Christ, even if the people around you are hostile to Christ. That is what makes us a conqueror, and it's to the conquerors who hold fast, who stand strong, that Jesus makes these amazing promises. And he says to hold fast until a certain time, really the end of our earthly race, in this difficult earthly race. And he says hold fast until he what? Until he comes, until he arrives. And we know a lot about the day in the future, the day that could happen at any moment when Jesus arrives. And we called it in previous lessons 3R Day, the day of Christ's return, him giving resurrection bodies to believers, and then the rapture of the church, him taking believers off the earth before the time of tribulation. As we have been getting our feet wet in the book of Revelation, we've seen the series of events that the book of Revelation describes, and really the prophetic chronology of what's coming for us as God's people. And the chronology is pretty simple. There's the rapture of the church before what we call the end times, the 7 years of judgment that's on the earth that the book of Revelation spends so much time on. After the 7-year tribulation, this is when Christ comes back and sets up his earthly kingdom, and we come back with him, and he reigns on earth for 1,000 years. But then, after the 1,000-year reign is over, then God creates a new heavens and a new earth, and the new earth is where we get to enjoy eternity with God. And as the book of Revelation promises these different rewards, some of these rewards we get on 3R Day, right, at the rapture of the church, the return of Christ for his church. Some of these rewards we get in his 1,000-year kingdom. Some of these rewards, I think some of the sweetest rewards we get on the new earth. So these rewards are spread out throughout the book of Revelation. And we stepped into Revelation asking the question, what are these rewards? Some of them are really easy to understand what they are. Some of them are more difficult to understand what in the world he's talking about. And when in the future do we get that specific reward? The first reward that we talked about last week is received on 3R Day, and I included them, the three that we talked about last week, on your outline for this morning. And that first reward that we will receive first chronologically on that day when Jesus comes back is this rescue. And Jesus reiterates this promise of rescue really just before, the chapter before Revelation goes into the 7-year tribulation, all the bad stuff that's going to happen on earth during that time of judgment. Jesus reiterates the promise that had been made 30 years before, 60 years before by Jesus himself, that we as his faithful believers, the conquerors, we will not go through that time of judgment that's coming. And that's really good news, especially as we're reading through the book of Revelation and reading about the crazy judgment of God during the 7 years, to know and be comforted that that's not for us. We're God's children. There's no wrath of God pointed at us. Jesus made that promise that will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to try those who dwell on the earth. And then he reiterates when he's going to rescue us on 3R Day. He says again, I'm coming soon. And we looked at the detailed description in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 about that rescue, the rescue before the time of judgment. And Paul writes about Jesus coming and taking us up to be with him. And from that point on, we noted that from the time of the rapture, we will always be with the Lord. And that helps us out in understanding where we are throughout the events of the future. We're always with Jesus. Wherever Jesus is, we're there with him. And it's very affirming that Jesus will rescue us before the time of judgment that's described in Revelation 4 through 19. Because when you read the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, he mentions the church 19 times. Chapters 4 through 19, he mentions the church 0 times. And that's because we're not on earth where the judgment that he's describing is happening. We're up in heaven watching it all play out up there, enjoying Jesus. So we said that this was the first promise that we're looking forward to, this rescue before the time of tribulation. And that is really a blessing or a prize that brings us through the 7-year tribulation. There's some more prizes we receive while we're in heaven with Christ during the time of judgment. The marriage supper of the Lamb, rewards at the Bema Seat judgment, those happen during that time. But this promise of rescue before the time of tribulation brings us through to Christ's return. And at Christ's return to set up his kingdom, we come back with him, and that begins the 1,000-year kingdom. And Jesus made some amazing promises to us about our role as his faithful servant during his 1,000-year kingdom on earth. And you remember that in Revelation chapter 19, it talks about the return of Jesus and return on a white horse, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, coming to the battle of Armageddon, right, to conquer his enemies, then set up his kingdom, and us coming with him. And in that Revelation 19 passage, it says that Jesus will rule the nations with a rod of iron, as the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then he promises us that during that time, that 1,000 years where he's reigning, we also will rule with him. And he even employs that same terminology in the promise to us. He says, to the one who conquers, I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, just like I have received that same authority from my Father. So we had that amazing promise last week of honor, being co-rulers with Christ. And I think this promise of being a co-ruler honored with Christ during the 1,000-year reign, it gets sweeter the more disenfranchised we are in this life, the more socially abused we are in this life, the less powerful we are in this life. When we look up the chain of command and it's so far and we see evil people doing evil things and we feel like we have no power to do it, this truth that when King Jesus comes back and sets up his kingdom that's characterized by righteousness, we're going to be in that kingdom servants and co-rulers with Jesus. We're going to receive that honor with Jesus. We're going to have that place with Jesus, and we're going to rule over even those who are enemies of Christ right there beside Jesus. And this ruling happens during the 1,000-year kingdom. That's when we get that reward. And then we looked at another reward that had a negative component and a positive component. And these are fulfilled at the end of the 1,000-year kingdom. And at the end of the 1,000-year kingdom is when what we commonly call final judgment takes place. And after the 1,000-year kingdom, then Satan is judged. He's thrown into the lake of fire. Those whose names are not written in the book of life, those who are not followers of Jesus Christ, they're thrown into the lake of fire. And that's a scary, scary proposition. And Jesus' promise to us is that scary thing, just like the 7 years of judgment, that's not for us either. The lake of fire is not for us. And he promises this, that the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. And then as the book of Revelation develops, we're told that the lake of fire is the second death. So it's another reiteration of Jesus that we're under the blessing of God, not a target of the judgment of God, and that our place in his family and in his kingdom are 100% secure. And he made this same statement in more of a positive way in another promise in Revelation 3. And he said, I will never blot your name out of the book of life. And we saw last week that in that final judgment, that's the only standard for who goes into the new earth to enjoy eternity with God, or who goes into the lake of fire to be punished for eternity, is if your name is written in the book of life. And because our name is written in the book of life, he guarantees, again, it's not going to change. I'm not going to take you out of there. You're secure with me. He says, you will be clothed in white robes. I will confess your name before my Father, and I will never take your name out of the book of life. And so these promises, with some other of the more obscure promises in the book of Revelation, these promises are emphasizing and comforting us and guaranteeing us that we're going to persevere until we get to the reward. He's encouraging, I'm never going to leave you. Right? I'm never going to forsake you. I'm never going to blot your name out of the book of life. There's no judgment coming for you. You're going to guaranteed enjoy eternity and the reward at the end. These are the ones that we talked about last week, up until the end of the 1,000-year kingdom and the final judgment. But the final judgment brings us then into the new earth. And the new earth is the place where you and I are going to spend eternity enjoying God's blessings and God's presence. And we're not going to go to heaven forever. That's not where we're going to spend eternity. God didn't design us that way. We are going to receive physical bodies, the resurrection bodies, on 3R Day, and then we're going to enjoy a very physical place called the New Earth that he describes in the last chapters of Revelation in great detail. I tried to persuade you guys in this week's Preparing Your Minds for Worship email to read the chapter and a half about the New Earth and the New Jerusalem. And I hope some of you did it, because there's so many details there in those last chapters of the book of Revelation. It's going to be a sweet place to live. I got good news and bad news. The bad news for some of you might be that we live in a city, New Jerusalem. But the gates are always open, and you've got an entire new earth to go out and enjoy. And if you want to go on a 2,000-year camping trip out on the new earth and then come back to your apartment in the New Jerusalem, that's fine. But as he describes what the New Jerusalem and the new earth are going to be like, they are indeed one of the greatest rewards and prizes that we have coming. Now, before he creates the new earth, global warming comes to its full effect as God incinerates this one, right? Humans don't have anything to do with it, the destruction of this planet. But 2 Peter tells us about the end of this planet, right, after the 1,000-year reign of Christ on this earth, and the creation of the new. And he says that the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and all the works that are done in them will be exposed. The heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. Okay, so he's scrapping the whole deal and creating a new earth and a new heavens, meaning outer space, the stars, the clouds, not a sun, because there's no sun in the new earth. But he's scrapping the old. He's creating a new, and he says, since we know these things, according to this promise, that's what we're waiting for. That's what we're looking for. This is the end game. This is our final destination. Although we have a few stops along the way, according to this promise, we're waiting for the new heavens and the new earth in which righteousness dwells. And this is a place, as described in those last chapters of Revelation, where there's no sin, there's no death, there's no corruption, there's no Satan, there's no rebellious humans. This is a place where God is on the new earth with us, and he rules in righteousness. Revelation, as it talks about the new earth, this is just a little snippet from chapter 21. It's a whole chapter and a half that talks about where we're going to live, and it's awesome. And he introduces it in Revelation chapter 21. He says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Peter told us how, right? And the sea was no more. There's no sea in the new earth. There's rivers, no sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So we've got this city, the New Jerusalem, and he's going to describe it a lot in the book of Revelation. It's up in heaven now. This is where God's throne is now. Jesus said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Hebrews talks about even saints like Abraham, knowing that God had prepared a city for them, and that's what they were looking for, this heavenly city. Well, this heavenly city, that the New Jerusalem that's in heaven now, once the new earth is created, that city comes down to earth. And one of the key differences on the new earth is that God's throne is on earth with us. His city, the New Jerusalem, comes down. His throne is down. Heaven, as we know it, where God's throne is now, angels are worshiping him. Souls of dead believers go. Heaven's vacant once the new earth is created, because God's throne is now on earth, and God is actually dwelling with us. And that's going to be crazy, because you can make an appointment to go have lunch with God right? This is a complete change in our experience. It's actually a complete rewind to Genesis, where Adam and Eve walked with God in the garden, right? We can't imagine that. God's always been in heaven. The second person of the Trinity came down and walked on earth, Jesus Christ, for 30 years, but we never got to hang out with him. But in the new earth, God's dwelling place is going to be there with us. Verse 3 says this in a loud voice. It says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. This is going to be an amazing, amazing reward that we receive. This reward of being able to enjoy the new earth with God's presence, free from sin, free from corruption, for all eternity. Now, he makes some promises, different promises that we receive on the new earth. And I'm not dealing with all the promises in Revelation 2 and 3. Some of them take a lot of explanation to come to a concrete understanding of what in the world he's talking about. The ones we've put up are more straightforward. And this one's a little complicated, but I wanted to talk about it because it's one we receive when we're on the new earth. And I primarily wanted to talk about it because it's strange. And he says, I will make the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. And this is really the reason I wanted to talk about this one. Because some pillars will be taller, some will be shorter. And most of the promises in Revelation, I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. This one didn't sound that awesome. To be turned into a pillar in the temple of God. And we know he's talking about the on the new earth because he also talks about the New Jerusalem, which is the capital city of the new earth. And I kind of struggled with this one because I want all good things that God wants to give me, but I really was hoping this would be a figurative promise, not a literal turn you into a pillar promise. And in the book of Revelation, we talked about this in home group as we've been discussing Revelation. Let's say avoid seeing anything as imagery unless you're given permission within the text to see it as imagery. If he says a demon comes out of the bottomless pit and it kills people and torments people, right? That's part of the 7-year tribulation. It's a demon that torments people. It's not a helicopter, right? So don't try and find imagery. Think that when he says something, he's talking about something else. Don't try and find that unless the text gives you permission. And in this case, I'm very thankful the text gives us permission to not take this literally, that we're going to be pillars in the temple of God on the new earth. And that's because when he's describing the new earth, he talks about some things that are absent on the new earth. And he talks about the absence of the sea, right? There'll be no sea on the new earth. He talks about the absence of the sun. There will be no sun or moon, but the glory of God will be the light that illuminates the entire new earth. There'll be no night because the light of God illuminates the world 24/7. And there are also on the new earth, he tells us, there will be no temple. He says, I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb. So when he says he's going to make us pillars in the temple of God on the new earth, he's not saying we're going to be literal pillars, because there's not a literal temple. There's not even a temple to be a pillar in. The pillar or the temple, he says, is the Lord God and the Lamb, is the Father and the Lamb. That's the central point of worship in the new earth. It's not a place. It's not a building with a door and with physical pillars. It's actually God's very presence. So as he's he's using this picturesque language to make us this really cool promise. And he says, I'll make you pillars. You will never go out. And he also says, I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God. And I will write on him my own new name. Jesus speaking here, my own new name. So we've got this interesting promise of being pillars in a non-literal temple that will be in the presence of the temple continually. And the temple is the Lord. So we'll be in the presence of the Lord continually. And then we've got these interesting promises of having names written all over us. Right? And I think the idea of both of these promises, the pillar promise and the names written on you promise, all are linked to this promise that we'll never go out of the presence of the true temple, which is the Lord and the Lamb. And when he says that I'm going to write my name on you, and I'm going to write the name of the city of my God, so it's going to say Father, Son, New Jerusalem on us somewhere. I think what he's trying to communicate, this might be a little naive, but I think he's going for this concept, like my daughter did with her doll, of clear expression of ownership and belonging. That we will not go out from his presence. We'll have a continual place in the presence of God, belonging in the presence of God, and he's going to write his name on us, that everybody knows we belong to him, and he's even going to write the name of the New Jerusalem. He's going to write the address, so that if we get lost, people will return us to God who owns us. I think that's the concept behind these more obscure promises of belonging to Christ. And I would say that this is at the core of these promises and others, for us to be able to live secure because we have permanent belonging with Christ. And this is number 4 on your outline, and the first one with a blank. To live secure because we have permanent belonging with Christ. And like much of the encouragements in the book of Revelation for us as believers, this is an encouragement that we're going to make it to the end. We belong to Christ. We are his possession. We're going to be with him from the day of his coming for his church all the way till when we get to become a pillar in the temple of God. We have a permanent belonging with Christ. Now, in the center, and get some good attention in the book of Revelation, the center of the city, there is a river, and around the river there is a tree, and it's a familiar tree. And he says that in the new earth, you're going to be able to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. And this promise is packed with awesomeness. First, it reaffirms that we're going to make it, because we're going to make it to the new earth, and we're even going to get to partake in the blessings of the new earth, eating from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. And is this the first time you've heard about the tree of life at the end of the book of Revelation? Right, where do we hear about the tree of life? Right, the very beginning, when God created this earth, and when Adam and Eve dwelt in perfect harmony with God on this earth. God planted a tree in the garden. He put the tree of life in the garden, but he also in Genesis put another tree. There were 2 trees. What was the other one? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the tree of life had a purpose within the Garden of Eden. And I believe the purpose was so that Adam and Eve would live continually. And we'll reference that from the book of Genesis. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that was the wild card. Because that was the tree that God said, gave the one rule: don't eat from that tree. And that's the rule that Adam and Eve broke. And that's the sin that plunged all of humanity into death and judgment, and just a mess that we're in now. But in the book of Revelation, in the new earth, the tree of life is there, but there is no tree of knowledge of good and evil. This is great news. It's not going to get messed up again. And he says that we're going to be able to eat from that tree. And in the book of Genesis, after Adam and Eve rebelled against God, he kicks them out of the garden, and he states the reason why he kicks them out of the garden is so that they will not eat from the tree of life. And for Adam and Eve, the tree of life is what gave them the ability to live forever in their created state. So he kicks them out of the garden so they don't have to live forever afflicted by sin, corruption, and sin and corruption. So he kicks them out of the garden so they can no longer eat from the tree. And then we don't really hear about the tree again until the book of Revelation. And the tree of life is given kind of as a centerpiece to the New Jerusalem. It's inside the city. So is the river. So it's there's some good urban development. What's that called when you build a park in the city? Anyway, it's a nice broad city with a river and the tree of life. And he says, the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God that's also in the city, and from the throne of the Lamb, and through the middle of the streets of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nation. And there's a lot in this promise. The promise was, right, simply, we're going to get to eat from this tree. That's awesome. And we just found out it's a fruit tree, and it's not just an apple tree or a pear tree or a peach tree. It actually has different type of fruit every month. And we get to go and enjoy it. And we already, at this point, have received resurrection bodies that are eternal. And we're not like Adam and Eve that have to eat from this tree to keep fueling our ability to live forever. But he says there's a function of the tree for the people of God. And he says it's the healing of the nations. And this brings up a question: why, if there's no death, no decay, and no sickness, why would the nations need healing? But it could also be translated and understood as therapy. It's the same Greek word we get therapeutic from. So it's for the therapy of the nations, the leaves of this tree. And what that looks like, I don't know, but it's medicinal, bro. And it doesn't give us eternal. It doesn't give us eternal life like it did Adam and Eve. It doesn't heal us from some sickness like you might think of it, the healing of the nations. But it's therapeutic. It's one more thing to enjoy about living on the new earth. Whatever therapy this gives us, it's going to be enjoyable. A second thing that the tree and the description of the tree reveals to us is that in eternity on the new earth, there is the passage of time. And there's this concept that God's outside of time. There's no time in heaven. It just kind of snaps by or something. But when we look and we see in heaven even, there's the passage of time. We see those who are martyred during the time of tribulation saying, when are you going to avenge our blood? Right? They're waiting. There's a passage of time. And in the new earth, there's a passage of time. There's no sun, there's no moon, there's no night, but there's still a passage of time. And you would think it might get difficult to know when it's January if you don't have the sun, moon, or night and day to keep track of everything. But the tree is actually the timekeeper. At least we know when a month has passed, because now it's a pear month. And then the next month passed, and it's apple month. The this fruit yields its fruit each month. So it's not this timeless, weird existence. It's a very concrete existence in a physical place with normal passage of time. The timekeepers, like the sun and the moon, aren't there, but the normal passage of time continues, and the tree becomes the time keeper. I was listening to Ben Shapiro, who's an extremely smart but unbelieving Jewish guy, and I couldn't argue with him about anything. But he made this argument that the creation story could not have actually happened in 7 or 6 literal days, because how could you have a day if the sun and the moon weren't created until a few days in, right? How could you can't have a day unless you have the sun and the moon, is what I'm saying. But that's bogus. Yeah, I don't need to have a watch on for the hour to pass, right? The timekeepers have nothing to do with the passage of time. They just measure the passage of time. And so it's bogus to say that in the creation that it can't be literal 6 days because the sun and the moon weren't created until day 2 or 3 or whatever. And it's just as bogus to say that in heaven there's no passage of time, it's timeless, God's outside of time, and that in the future for eternity there's no passage of time. The tree indicates that yes, there is the passage of time, and it keeps track of the passage of time, at least according to months. Now another issue that the tree brings up, and the presence of the tree of life and the absence of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is this issue of choice. And it's another bogus thing, kind of like the God's outside of time thing that just confuses everything about God's character and activities. But another, the bogus proposition that God had to put the tree of knowledge and good and evil in the garden. He had to, because if we were going to love him, we had to have the choice to eat from the tree and rebel against it. If we didn't have freedom of our will to rebel against God, then God couldn't know that he was truly loved. We'd just be like a bunch of robots, and then that wouldn't satisfy God's insecurity about being loved. He needed us to make the choice, right? And that's why he continues to allow us to make the choice, because he wants to be loved. But what we see in the new earth is God gives us absolutely no choice. There's no tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's no potential at all for rebelling against him. But that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. Autonomy is actually a bad thing. And we can see the results of autonomy, self-rule in the world. Right? That's not a good thing. But actually, we see God's people without the choice to rebel against him. We have no choice to rebel against him in the new earth. But we see God and his people living in perfect harmony and relationship. So this bogus idea that God had to give the opportunity to rebel so our love would be more authentic and we wouldn't be robots is just bogus. Our love in the new earth is authentic as ever. It's more authentic for God than ever. And in that situation, we have absolutely no choice at all. And the whole concept of having a free will, a moral free will, or this concept of choice is just an unbiblical concept. The Bible doesn't present us as being neutral and either choosing to obey God or choosing to go our own path and be our own king. When the Bible presents us, it presents us as slaves. And there's two options. Either we're a slave to sin, or we're a slave to God. There is no autonomy. There is no free will. We're either a slave to sin or a slave to God. And in Romans, he talks about this. He says, don't you know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you're slaves to the one whom you obey. And then he gives the either or proposition. And a free agent isn't one of the options. He says either a slave of sin, which leads to death, or a slave of obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God that he changed us. We weren't autonomous. We were slaves to sin. He says that thanks be to God that you who were once slaves to sin have now become obedient from the heart to the standards of teaching to which you're committed, to the message about Jesus Christ and the truth about Jesus Christ. And having been set free from your autonomy, nobody's autonomous, and set free from your slavery to sin, you have become slaves to righteousness. So we have this lie presented of autonomy and free will, which really doesn't exist. We're either a slave to sin or a slave to God, a slave to the kingdom of darkness or a member of the kingdom of light. And that was really the lie from the beginning from Satan, is this proposition of autonomy, this proposition of exercising your free will, coming out from under the leadership of God. And Satan may have proposed it as autonomy and free will to Adam and Eve, but he was lying. Autonomy is actually slavery. We can say, oh, I'm autonomous from God. I'm exercising my free will apart from God. But we're actually a slave. We're a slave to sin. There is no neutral autonomy, free agent humans, either a slave to sin or a slave to God. And the results are terrible. He says, for when you were a slave to sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. But what fruit were you getting at the time from the things in which you are now ashamed? The end of those things is death. The end of that supposed freedom and autonomy is shame and death. But now you have been set free from sin and become a slave to God. The fruit you get that leads to sanctification and its end is eternal life. So when we see the absence of the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the new earth, this is a great thing, because human autonomy, human free will, human choice only results in shame and death. But what do you get if you take away human autonomy and free will completely and make everybody just completely righteous and completely in love with God? What kind of place do you get? That's what you get is not a chaos of autonomy, an autonomous zone, but instead a place that's autonomy free. And the place of freedom from autonomy is a place that's freedom from everything that's bad. Right? That's where we want to be. We don't want autonomy. We don't want the opportunity to choose to rebel against God. We want it as God has planned for our perfect experience with him in the new earth, a place where there's no longer anything accursed. This is part of his final description of our prize in the new earth. He says, no longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. There will be no need of the light of the lamp of the sun or the sun, for the Lord will be the light, and they will reign with him forever and ever. This is our forever and ever story. This is our forever and ever place, our forever and ever blessing and reward there in the new earth with King Jesus, free from the effects of sin, free from sin in us, free from sin around us, free even from that nasty potential of sin, enjoying God forever and ever. This is the last blank on your outline. To live stable, because we're sure to make it to the true paradise. We see what human designed paradises look like, and they're all a dump. But God's paradise, the true paradise, is a place completely free from anything evil and completely enjoying the blessings and rewards of him forever and ever. We're going to make it by the promise of God, the plan of God, and the power of God. We're going to make it to the paradise of God for sure. These are these amazing rewards presented in the book of Revelation. These are the rewards that he says, hold fast, Keep the faith, walk through the difficulty of this life serving me, because these amazing rewards are coming. Now, as we close, I want to put up a little bit more developed chart from our series in the book of Revelation. And this is basically the same content, but looking at the cross, Jesus' death, the present age or the church age, where we are right now, and the first event in the prophetic future coming, 3R Day, the rapture of the church, where we're taken up to be with Christ, and the world goes through the 7 years of judgment. Then the marriage supper of the Lamb, the return of Christ, us coming back with him, Armageddon, setting up his 1,000-year kingdom, the judgment of Satan, throwing in the lake of fire, final judgment of unbelievers, and then the new earth that we just talked about. Having ran through this in the last 3 weeks, I want to open it up now for questions. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A. It can be about anything from the rapture to the new earth. Tom, I see that hand. Don't be shy. There's lots of questions about this stuff. We spend a whole hour and a half Q&A at home. Good.
So is Satan and Satan free and there will be believers?
So we've got there's 2 questions. One question is, during the 1,000 years, will Satan be free? Because he's thrown in the lake of fire at the end of the 1,000 years. But it tells us that the first thing Christ does after Armageddon, before he starts the 1,000-year kingdom, is he imprisons Satan for the 1,000 years. So Satan has absolutely no influence on the earth during those 1,000 years. At the end of the 1,000-year reign, we have this account of a rebellion, a human rebellion against Christ, who's ruling in Jerusalem. And it's led by Satan when at the end of the 1,000 years, God lets him out of prison, and he raises up this rebellion of humans, and they come and assault Jerusalem, and then fire comes down from heaven and incinerates them all, and it's over, and then we go to the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. And part of your question would be, how does, at the end of the 1,000-year reign, who are these humans that are aligning with Satan to rebel against Jesus? I thought we were all servants of Jesus. And for the most part, we're all servants of Jesus. Remember, we're there, and we had received our resurrection body at the rapture on 3R Day. We're free from sin personally. We're not going to be rebelling against God. We're ruling with him during his 1,000-year kingdom, and we're coming back with him. So we're part of that kingdom, but we're not going to be joining Satan's side or rebelling against him. There's believers that they weren't believers at the time of the rapture, but during the 7-year tribulation, it's as much a time of salvation as it is of judgment. Masses of people repent and turn in faith to Christ during the time of judgment. And those most of them are killed by the Antichrist and his Antichrist forces. They're killed, but at the beginning of the 1,000-year reign, they're going to receive their resurrection bodies, and they're going to be part of the 1,000-year kingdom with us, but they're not going to rebel against God, right? They gave their life for him during the time of tribulation, and they've received their resurrection bodies. They're free from sin. But there's a small group that they go through the tribulation. Either they're believers or unbelievers. They don't die during the tribulation, either from the judgment of God or from persecution of believers. And there's a small group of believers and unbelievers that make it to Christ's return. And at Christ's return, there's something called the sheep and goats judgment, where it's a small judgment of the survivors of the tribulation, where Jesus says, "I'm going to separate the goats on my left and the sheep on my right." And the goats go to hell. The sheep enter into the kingdom, right? And so we've got this small group of tribulation survivors. They're still mortals. They don't have the resurrection body like we got on 3R Day, or the tribulation martyrs got at the beginning of the 1,000-year reign. These are people that enter into Christ's kingdom as mortals. And they're those that have aligned themselves with Christ during the tribulation, but they survive. So they get to enter into the tribulation, and then we see a population growth from those mortals during the tribulation. The population continues to grow. They have kids who have kids who have kids, and their offspring, just like our offspring, some are believers. They serve King Jesus, who's there in Jerusalem. Some are not believers, and they, in their heart, they want to rebel against King Jesus. So a mixed population of mortal believers and unbelievers is growing during the 1,000-year reign. And so when Satan is released at the end of the 1,000 years, then those who are those mortals that have been born during the 1,000 years, they join forces with him in that rebellion against Christ. And we had talked about this at a home group, like why. Some of the why of the 1,000 years. Why doesn't he just return and then make the new earth? Why doesn't he just do that? And I think part of it is proving the point to humanity that his judgment is justified, that before the final judgment at the end, humanity, that group that started as a small group and had more kids and more kids and more kids, they've been able to live in the perfect environment for spiritual thriving. They've been able to live under the direct rule of Jesus, physically on his throne in Jerusalem. They've been led by we who have received resurrection bodies, ruling with him and ruling perfectly in righteousness, completely uncorrupted, unselfish leadership. And Satan has been in prison. They can't blame it on Satan, their heart of rebellion. So when God allows this 1,000 years, I think one thing he's making a point that even without Satan's influence, even even in the perfect environment for spiritual flourishing, the heart of man is still wicked. And his judgment, his final judgment, which is a severe judgment, all those who are treasonous against him being put in the lake of fire at the end of the 1,000 years, is completely justified. Is that a good answer to short, long answer, short question? Go ahead. Yeah. If there's no free will, because their names are in the book of life, and they do it. We're gone. We can't tell them about it. We are not here to preach the gospel, but there's Bibles here at the beginning or during the 7 years. God calls and saves. Converts 144,000 Jewish background people. They're now Christians, and they represent Christ in the world. You can't kill them during the 1,000 years. He's got the 2 witnesses. They can't be killed preaching in Jerusalem. He's got angels flying around preaching the gospel. And so those during the 7 that entered into the tribulation as unbelievers, who were chosen to be adopted as sons and daughters before the foundation of the world, and their names are, as a result, are in the book of life. They then come to faith during the 7-year tribulation, and they're part of the group that enters in as mortals into the 1,000 years. So the way that they come, if it's not about free will, it's because their names also are in the book of life, which is the standard for not going into the lake of fire in the final judgment.
The mortals have the same lifespan
There's I haven't seen any indication of a change that they as they came into the tribulation, that's the state they exit the tribulation. So I don't see anything otherwise. But
I thought we could have said that before the 7-year, right before the 7-year tribulation, that's when the demons are set free. Did you not say that? That's when they.
The helicopter comment.
Yeah.
Oh, so that'll be during the 7 years.
So that's when they are loosened on.
I mean, demons are loose right now. Right, Satan's loose right now. But there's the description of a bottomless pit, and Abaddon, the commander of the demons of the bottomless pit, and the bottomless pit is open, and these demons come out and torment people. So it's a special forces demons, I guess.
Okay, or maybe ones that the angels meet now.
Yeah, they're locked up. They're in the bottomless pit.
Because that's what I thought, that certainly you're here now.
Yeah, good.
So, I'm very honored to be co-ruler of Christ. Sounds like it'd be a lot of work, so we can anticipate, continue,
Yeah, and when we
all this now.
and as we flush out the 1,000-year kingdom and flush out the new earth, right? There's a lot of detail. It's a very real place, and like you said, and even in the new earth, he says that the kings of the nations will bring in offerings to God. So even in the new earth, there's society, there's structures, there's kings, there's nations. It's more developed than we ever imagined. And yes, you will have a role both in the 1,000-year kingdom, ruling with Christ, over this increasing and growing population that came as mortals out of the tribulation. Some of them loving Christ, some of them rebelling Christ. That's why you have to rule them with a rod of iron, like he does, because some of them still have a rebellious heart. So yeah, we'll have a job to do during the 1,000 years. We'll have a job to do during the new earth, but I think the compensation is worth it. Good.
I'm from those that died during the 1,000-year kingdom. Do they get the ones that align with Christ? Do they get a resurrection body, or do they have to wait until they're old?
Yeah. So you're asking unbelievers that die during this time,
Or
right?
Believers.
Believers. Yeah. So you got unbelievers and believers who enter in their mortal state and then die during that time. We have to work from the two bookends, because it doesn't say specifically with unbelievers what happens to their souls during the narrative of the 1,000 years, but we know that unbelieving mortals who come to the sheep and goat judgment, their souls go to hell at the sheep and goat judgment. So we could, looking back, we could say the pattern in the most recent is their souls go to hell, just like souls of unbelievers go to hell now. And then we can also look forward, and we can see at the final judgment, it says that hell gives up the souls of unbelievers for the final judgment, and they receive resurrection bodies at the end of the 1,000 years. So we've got, I would say, just like during the tribulation, during the present age, during the 1,000-year kingdom, if an unbeliever dies, their spirit goes to hell, their body goes in the dirt, and then at the end of the 1,000 years is the resurrection of the wicked and the final judgment of the wicked, and they receive the resurrection bodies at that time. Their souls come out of hell, they receive the resurrection bodies, they face final judgment, and then hell, they don't go back to hell. It says that hell is thrown into the lake of fire, and they're thrown into the lake of fire as well. So just like heaven's not our permanent eternal home, hell is not their permanent eternal home. It's the lake of fire.